Welcome to Pacific States University's online lecture series for Gen 108 Explorations in the Arts. Today, we are diving into the delicate, intimate, and often wonderfully playful world of the Rococo, a movement that totally defined the early 18th century, right before the tides of revolution and the Enlightenment fundamentally reshaped the Western world. I am so glad you're joining this session. We're going to explore how art, architecture, and society went through this profound transformation. We're moving away from the heavy, grandiose displays of absolute monarchs and stepping into a culture that prized wit, sensuality, and ultimately a fierce return to what philosophers of the time deemed natural. Here is a super quick look at our agenda for today. We'll start with the death of the Sun King, define the Rococo aesthetic, and check out the fête galante. Then we'll dive into sensuality in art, explore the Enlightenment backlash, and finish up with the transition to Neoclassicism. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The Death of the Sun King, the Decentralization of French Culture.
Okay, to truly understand the Rococo, we've got to set the stage and look at the pivotal year of 1715. For decades before this, French culture was entirely centralized at the immense Palace of Versailles, under the absolute rule of Louis XIV, the famous Sun King. The art of his reign was the Baroque. It was grandiose, massive, highly formal, and specifically designed to inspire awe and reinforce the absolute power of the monarchy. Imagine heavy theatrical spaces steeped in rigid protocol. But then, 1715 brings the death of Louis XIV, and with it a monumental shift in high society. The aristocracy was basically exhausted from the rituals of the king's court. So, what did they do? They packed their bags. They moved away from the sprawling, isolated Palace of Versailles and headed back into the city, moving into these elegant, newly built townhouses in Paris. And in these private homes, a brand new social phenomenon was born, the salon. Now, this wasn't just a living room, it was the beating heart of intellectual and social life. Hosted by wealthy, highly educated society hostesses, these gatherings were fiercely competitive. They attracted the most famous artists, writers, and thinkers of the day. In the salon, your currency was your wit. Conversation was an art form, a quick, deft repartee that people back then frequently compared to a fencing match. It was an environment where sophisticated artifice absolutely reigned supreme.
Section 2. Defining the Rococo aesthetic, from pebbles to mirrors. So, a new, sophisticated lifestyle obviously required a new backdrop, right? Let's define the term itself, because it tells us exactly what we need to know about the aesthetic. Rococo is actually derived from the French word rocaille, which literally translates to pebble. Originally, this term referred to the small stones, shells, and shell-like forms that decorators used to embellish the interiors of artificial grottos in wealthy gardens. This organic, irregular, undulating shape of a seashell became the absolute principal ornamental motif of the entire era. It was a total departure from strict geometry, favoring the asymmetric, playful curves you'd actually find in nature. Notice how directly this intimacy contrasts with the Baroque era we just left behind. Unlike those heavy, dark, awe-inspiring Baroque halls, the Rococo has primarily an interior design style focused on warmth and closeness. These aristocratic townhouses featured smaller, far more comfortable spaces meant for private conversation rather than grand state declarations. You'll also notice a massive emphasis on sinuous lines. You really won't find many hard right angles here. Instead, you get these organic, flowing curves. The colors shifted dramatically, too, to soft palettes. We're talking loads of silver, gold, and delicate pastel hues. When you look at the Hall of Mirrors in the Amalienburg, designed by François de Cuvelier, you see this breathtaking, dazzling silver and blue ensemble. Notice the stucco relief, the crystal, the mirrors. Everything seems to be in a state of organic growth. The architecture itself literally feels weightless. The light from those windows multiplies across the glass, bathing the room in this scintillating glow. It's the ultimate refinement of spatial illusion, designed entirely to flatter the elegant guests moving within it. Section 3. Painting the Fête Galante, the art of Antoine Watteau. As interior design transformed, the canvas had to follow suit, and Antoine Watteau is arguably the figure most synonymous with the Rococo era. He captured the shifting tastes of the time so perfectly that the incredibly rigid French Royal Academy actually had to invent an entirely new rule just to accommodate him. The category they created was the Fête Galante, or amorous festival. These were paintings entirely dedicated to depicting the outdoor amusements of French high society, invariably set in these lush, overgrown, slightly melancholic woodland parks. Photo: Pilgrimage to Cythera by Antoine Watteau, featuring wealthy patrons in refined, poised attitudes. Consider his masterpiece, Pilgrimage to Cythera. When Watteau submitted this in 1717, it completely baffled the Academy.
It wasn't a grand history painting, it wasn't a classical portrait, and it wasn't a standard landscape. But the sheer quality and the appeal of these wealthy patrons engaged in refined, poised flirtation was just undeniable. The Academy basically had to bend to the changing cultural tide, and the Fete Galante was officially born. Now, this shift illustrates a massive theoretical debate happening in the art world at the time, between two camps, the Poussinists and the Rubinists. It was like a huge intellectual showdown. The Poussinists, named after the classical painter Nicolas Poussin, championed rigid, formal lines and drawing as the intellectual core of art. They believed art should appeal strictly to the mind. But Watteau, he belonged firmly to the Rubinists, followers of the vibrant Peter Paul Rubens. They argued that color was the true essence of painting because it spoke directly to the senses and the emotions. Watteau absolutely prioritized color over line. He created these hazy, dreamlike atmospheres where the boundaries of objects just sort of soften. He was a master at capturing shimmering surfaces. Just look at the way he paints the light catching on silk at a bent knee or the iridescence of a glossy satin dress. His figures move in slow, refined attitudes that perfectly reflected the suave gentility his wealthy patrons saw in themselves. It was an art of pure feeling, mood, and exquisite texture. Section 4. Sensuality in art. Erotic playfulness on canvas and clay. As the 18th century wore on, the art became even bolder. The Rococo aesthetic naturally progressed deeper into themes of sensual intimacy. If Watteau was the melancholic poet of the Rococo, Jean-Honoré Fragonard was absolutely its mischievous playwright. Photo: The Swing by Jean-Honoré Fragonard, depicting a young lady boldly kicking off her shoe toward a statue of Cupid while her lover watches from the bushes. Take a moment to truly observe this composition. Art historians frequently describe the setting of Fragonard's magnificent 1766 masterpiece, The Swing, as a perfumed bower resembling a stage for comic opera. The scene is a blatantly flirtatious narrative. You have this young, beautifully dressed lady on a swing, being pushed by an older man in the dim background. And right at the height of her arc, she boldly kicks off her delicate shoe toward a marble statue of Cupid, who is holding his finger to his lips in a gesture of secrecy. And there, hidden in a highly strategic position in the lush bushes below, is her young lover, enjoying a rather revealing view. The glowing pastels, the soft, dappled light piercing the canopy, the frothy rendering of the trees. The technique itself conveys sensuality just as much as the scandalous subject matter does. But this playfulness wasn't limited to flat canvases. Let's examine how this aesthetic translates into the realm of sculpture, particularly with an artist named Claude Michel, better known as Claudion. Claudion took this exact spirit of erotic fantasy and translated it into highly accessible, three-dimensional formats. Unlike the massive marble monuments of the past designed for public squares or grand palaces, Claudion worked frequently in inexpensive terracotta. His scale was diminutive. These were tabletop pieces. The theme, beautifully captured in his Satyr Crowning of Bacchante, was pure sensuous Rococo fantasy. And the setting for these works? They were meant to be placed directly inside those intimate Parisian salons we talked about earlier. The terracotta medium retains the warmth and energy of the artist's hands, allowing viewers to lean in close, handle the art, and really enjoy the exhilaration of the style in a deeply personal, accessible way. Section 5. The Enlightenment Backlash. The return to the natural. However, history never stays in one place for long. The pendulum inevitably swings back. By the mid-18th century, a powerful new intellectual movement was sweeping across Europe, the Enlightenment. This was an era that began to prioritize empirical evidence, scientific questioning, and profound moral reasoning over the frivolous artifice of the salon. The philosophical turning point is perfectly captured by the thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He began to argue vehemently that high society, with all its elaborate manners, immense wealth, and decadent art, had actually corrupted human beings. He famously stated, "Man by nature is good. He is depraved and perverted by society." Now that was a bombshell to the established order. Suddenly, the exquisite artifice of the Rococo wasn't just seen as silly, it was seen as morally bankrupt. Rousseau and his contemporaries called for a massive cultural rejection of the Rococo in favor of natural virtue, honesty, and simplicity. They firmly believed art should elevate the moral character, not just indulge the senses. The art world responded to this call for morality and nature in three highly distinct ways. First, through the praise of domestic virtue, led by Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin. Second, through biting satire, championed in England by William Hogarth. And third, through a sophisticated hybrid approach called grand manner portraiture, perfected by Thomas Gainsborough. Let's break down how each of these artists dismantled the Rococo dominant. First up, praising domestic virtue. Photo Saying Grace by Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin, depicting a quiet, virtuous scene of a rural family. Look closely at this quiet masterpiece, Saying Grace by Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin. Chardin entirely turned his back on the perfumed elite culture of the salons. There are no shimmering silks, no hidden lovers in the bushes, no mythological cupids here. Instead, he paints the quiet, honest life of ordinary, often rural families. The colors are muted, relying on earthy browns and soft whites, and the light is calm and highly realistic. By focusing on a mother teaching her children a simple prayer before a modest meal, Chardin is directly answering Rousseau's call. He's showing the viewer that true goodness, dignity, and moral worth are found in the simple, everyday lives of the uncorrupted working class, far away from the decadence of Paris. Across the English Channel, the response was a bit more aggressive. The second approach was satirizing the elite. Here we have William Hogarth's breakfast scene from his famous series, Marriage à la Mode. Hogarth is fascinating because he essentially weaponized the Rococo aesthetic against itself. He uses the intricate detail and the sharp visual wit of the era to mercilessly skewer the very moneyed classes that usually commissioned this art. In this scene, we see a young aristocratic couple suffering the disastrous morning after effects of an arranged, loveless, and highly immoral marriage. The husband is slouched and exhausted from a night of philandering. You can actually see a suspicious lady's cap hanging right out of his pocket. The wife is stretching after throwing a decadent card-playing party. Meanwhile, their accountant is literally walking away in absolute disgust with a stack of unpaid bills and a ledger. It's a brilliant, highly moralizing, and deeply funny critique of aristocratic corruption.
And the third response is what we call the hybrid style of the grand manner. Examine Thomas Gainsborough's portrait of Mrs. Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Gainsborough wasn't quite ready to throw away the beautiful techniques of the Rococo. He still uses that incredibly soft light and the feathery, delicate brushwork that makes the subject look so effortlessly elegant. However, notice where he places her. She's not in a highly manicured French garden or a lavishly decorated interior salon. She is seated directly on the ground in an unspoiled, rustic, wild landscape. Her hair is blowing naturally in the wind, totally untamed by the rigid styling of the court. Gainsborough is brilliantly merging the sophisticated painterly technique of the era with the new Enlightenment demand for natural beauty, projecting an air of pure, ingenuous sweetness that feels deeply authentic.
Section 6. Transition to Neoclassicism, the fall of artifice.
As we wrap up today, consider the sweeping historical trajectory we've traced throughout this session. The Rococo began as an act of rebellion, a much-needed move away from the massive, rigid formality of the Baroque, offering a world of intimacy, sparkling wit, and beautiful organic artifice. Yet, the very qualities that made it so deeply popular, its intense focus on exclusive pleasure, delicate surfaces, and the decadent leisure of the elite, eventually sealed its doom. The Enlightenment's growing doctrine of progress simply couldn't tolerate an art form built on illusion and frivolity. Rousseau's call for a return to nature paved the way for an art that had to be serious, empirical, and morally grounded. By the end of the 18th century, the scintillating shell motifs, the fake gallants, and the pastel flirtations of the Rococo entirely gave way. They were completely replaced by Neoclassicism, an artistic movement fueled by a renewed fascination with the severe lines, the heroic rationality, and the stoic civic virtues of ancient Greece and Rome. Art was, once again, tasked with building better citizens.
Which leaves us with a really profound question to ponder as we close out our time today. How exactly did these quiet, moral Enlightenment ideals of natural virtue transition into the absolute bloody revolutionary fervor of the late 18th century? Because, as we'll see, a fierce belief in reason and virtue can quickly become a very dangerous weapon. Thank you so much for joining me for Gen 108 today. I can't wait to explore that historical explosion with you in our very next session.